this. You guys, everyone hear that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, several people had emailed and said that they couldn't join us and asked if we can record this. So we will attempt this. Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome. We are really excited today to have Russ Cohen join us. He's going to be talking about edible plants, as you can tell from our conversation, both those that you can find in your neighborhood and plant in your backyard. And before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about the West Newbury Wild and Native Group. This talk is co-sponsored by the West Newbury Library and the Wild and Native Group. And the West Newbury Wild and Native is a group that recently formed last year. And it's a group of residents from West Newbury, and we have some from adjacent towns as well, that are very passionate about promoting native plants, pollinator gardens and wildlife gardens, and controlling invasives. We believe that the preservation of natural biodiversity is best done 1 yard at a time. And we are working to educate and empower every gardener and landowner in West Newbury to preserve and restore native habitat. So before we introduce Russ, I want to just mention a few housekeeping items for our Zoom presentation tonight. As I mentioned, this is being recorded. While Russ is presenting, I'm asking that you mute yourself and turn off your cameras. We're going to have a question and answer session after the presentation where you can ask your questions and you can turn your cameras back on. And when we call on you, you can unmute. If you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and type them into the chat box. Carol and I will be monitoring that. And if it's a clarifying question or something that we can ask Russ, we will go ahead and interrupt him. Russ, is that okay?
Sure.
Otherwise, we'll wait till the end of the presentation to get those questions answered. I think that's all we have for the Zoom logistics. Does anybody have any questions before I introduce Russ? Okay, so Russ Cohen is the author of the book, Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten, and he is the foremost expert on edible plants in Essex County. And just so you know, all proceeds from the sale of his book goes towards Essex County Greenbelt, and you can purchase his book from their website. Russ has served as the river advocate for the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration for over 2 decades, with his expertise in riparian vegetation. Since retiring in 2016, Russ has had more time to pursue his passion, which is connecting to nature via his taste buds, and he is sharing that with all of us tonight. Russ is now playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for edible native plants. He has set up a small nursery in Weston where he grows and keeps over 1,000 plants that he propagates from seed or obtains from other sources. He is partnering with land trusts, cities and towns, schools and colleges, state and federal agencies, organic farms, tribal groups, and others to plant plants from his nursery in appropriate places on their properties. Russ has initiated over 24 such projects in the past years, and I guess probably more than that now, Russ. Maybe you can talk about some of those projects later today too. And I also want to mention that for those of you that were lucky enough to get a spot, Russ is coming tomorrow to Mill Pond, where he's going to be giving a talk, and a few of you I know have signed up and will be joining him for that walk. So without further ado, Russ, go ahead and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Let me just pull up my screen here and let's see if which one it's going to work. Let's see if this works. Okay. Okay, so can you see that okay?
Yes, we're good.
All right, good. So let me just advance to the next slide and you tell me when it shows up, okay? Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, so it took a little bit of a delay, so I'll just be prepared for that. All right, so welcome everyone. I feel a little kind of in a time warp because yesterday I actually gave 2 in-person slide programs, one for garden club and one for library, which is of course what I did until, you know, the pandemic came. So I feel like, okay, well, you know, I can hybridize, I can do this, and the in-person things is fine. And of course, tomorrow is an in-person walk. And by the way, during the walk tomorrow, for those of you that will be joining us, you should know that when I walk a landscape, I talk about all the things that are edible. So the edible weeds, the edible invasives, as well as the edible natives. Because one nice thing about the edible weeds and invasives is that it's kind of a more relaxed foraging, as you don't have to worry so much about the potential adverse ecological impacts of picking more than you should. For ecological reasons, you can pretty much enjoy, like, for example, dandelions. If we all did nothing else the rest of our lives but pick dandelions, we couldn't make a dent in how many dandelions there are on Earth. So harvesting dandelions, you can relax about it. But when native species are involved, I encourage people to use some forbearance and restraint when gathering them, just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. Of course, if you've got stuff growing in your yard, then, you know, you can treat that a little bit differently. But in general, gathering from the wild, make sure that you're not adversely affecting the plants or the animals that rely upon those plants, or the habitats where the plants grow and stuff like that. All right, before I get into more details about that, you may have seen the slide that's up on the screen right now that's used a lot in land acknowledgements. And it's important to acknowledge not only that where we are right now, wherever you are, was Native American territory. And Native Americans still are present in throughout New England and in Essex County, which is great. And so I want to acknowledge that, but I want to take a step further and say that the knowledge I'm sharing with you tonight, I want to acknowledge and express my gratitude for the fact that Native Americans figured a lot of this stuff out, because they, of course, were here for thousands of years interacting with these plants way before European extraction people like me showed up. So much of the knowledge I'm sharing with you tonight was, I'm sure, originally acquired by our indigenous peoples in this region. So that's great. So besides that, let me also single out one person in particular, and that's Robin Wall Kimmerer, who, among other things, wrote this terrific book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that I recommend. If you haven't read it already, it's really fantastic book. If you're interested in plants, I think you really like it. And in Robin's book, she has something called the Honorable Harvest, which is a good guideline to use to guide your foraging. And so I recommend the book I mean, the whole book is terrific, but this is a part of it that can be really applied in terms of interacting with plants out in the wild. All right, and I'll talk a little bit more about Native American traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, as we get into my talk tonight. Okay, but before I do that, let's talk about this guy. So were this a live program, I'd be asking you in the audience, is there anybody in the audience that hasn't heard of Doug Tallamy? And believe it or not, I gave a talk to a garden club yesterday, and there were at least 40 people in the audience, and at least 30 people's hands went up. They'd never heard of Doug Tallamy. So of course I had to enlighten them and tell his story about how, as an entomologist, he made this very astute observation that as our migratory songbirds fly back from their wintering grounds and they build their nests and lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch and the parent birds are searching for food to feed their babies, they're mainly finding caterpillars to feed their babies, and they're mainly finding those caterpillars on the native plants. Now, why is that? It's because since plants can't move, their major defense is chemical, and they have got some chemical defenses that prevent them from being eaten to death. But a lot of our native insect species have figured out ways to get around those chemical defenses, and the native insects don't eat the plants into extinction, of course, because that would wipe out their food supply. So the host plants and the insects are in a dynamic equilibrium, and they're pretty much getting along okay. and the birds take advantage of that and find the caterpillars to feed their babies on the native plants. So a neighborhood that isn't planted with native plants is like a food desert to a bird that's seeking food for their babies. So that's the eloquent point that Doug likes to make, and he gives a lot of talks. He's written several books. Whoops, I clicked on his name, which I didn't mean to do, and now it's going to bounce me out to the internet, which I don't want to do. So let's see if I can escape that. Oh boy, let's get out of there. There we go. All right, now we're back here. I'm going to avoid clicking any of my links in my presentation. Okay, so anyway, so Doug gives talks and he wrote several books, and let's just do my regular clicker here. There we go. So here's one of his most recent books, and this underscores Nancy's point that she just made, because this book, Nature's Best Hope, Doug says, is all of us, in terms of all of us that own yards or rent properties where we can do some planting, in terms of us working more native species into our planting for the ecological reasons. It's really important. So as Doug is getting out his gospel, lots of people are paying attention, including lots of nonprofit organizations, state agencies, stuff like that. So there's some really good outreach materials getting out there to educate people about native species, to indicate how to find them, what plants are appropriate for which properties and stuff like that. All really good. Okay, so now let me tell you about a talk I attended at the Ecological Landscape Alliance conference about 5 years ago. It was given by a woman named Kate Venturini from Rhode Island. And her mission at the time was to meet with homeowners that live along Narragansett Bay and get them to put native plants in their yard as a way of establishing a vegetative buffer between like their lawns and the roadways and stuff like that, and Narragansett Bay, to help absorb pollutants before it got into the bay and help keep the bay water cleaner. Really important, laudable objective. All right, in her talk, she had this plant list. And I'm sure most of you have seen plant lists like this. We have the name of the plant on the left, and then you have all these columns to the right stating various attributes, like grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade, and so on. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't tell people that. And I said, why not? And she said, we don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You have blueberry in your list. Are you suggesting to people that they plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. We might as well tell them what else is edible. So now in Rhode Island, they do. Their list has an edibility column. There it is right there. And here is the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too provides an additional powerful incentive for people to plant them that might be insufficiently induced to do so just in the pure ecological argument. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for a second. So in my mind, I imagine a married couple, husband and wife, living in a house with a good sized yard. And the wife has heard Doug Tallamy's talk, or she's read Doug Tallamy's book, and she's says the husband, hey, we have to go native in our landscaping. It's really important. This when the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. So that way she can bring him to one of my talks or find out more about edible native species. And I realize it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in natives, but my hunch is that it's going to woo an additional group of people that aren't sold in just the pure, to use a pejorative term, the bug and bunny argument. Do it because it's good for the bugs and the bunnies. So anyway, that's what the theme of tonight's talk is. So I'm totally fine, and I think it's great if people are planting non-edible native species too, to benefit pollinators and birds and stuff like that. It's just there's over 180 species of plants that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people too. So it's a pretty big list of plants. And so I will tell you how to figure out what those are. So first of all, you need to know, well, what is native? So really good source for that is this website, Go Botany, that's maintained by the New England, well, it was the New England Wildflower Society. Now it's called the Native Plant Trust. And what you'll see for each species is you'll see an outline map of New England where you have the counties. That's the black lines here. And if a county is colored in green, that means that species is deemed to be native to that county. If this color was pink, then it'll be non-native to the county. So check for that. You see green for Essex County, you know, oh, definitely native for this area. Okay, and then some people pay attention to ecotypes and local ecotype, and their feeling is it's really important to have local ecotype seed or local ecotype plants that you put in your yard. And I think there's, arguments on both sides of it. I think what you can say about choosing local ecotype plants is that if you are able to get them, since they are from the same region where you are, their chance of succeeding in your yard is greater than a plant brought in from somewhere else that might not have the built-in adaptability to the conditions here. All right. So here's a great source for seed, and also really great webpage with really great information. There's the Wild Seed Project nonprofit up in Maine. We get seeds in these little packets, like this little red packet here, and then you sow them and get plants from them. And also the website up here is got some great information on how to grow plants. So I encourage you to check that out. All right, now here's, last but not least, here's a really wonderful resource that the Native Plant Trust has called their Plant Finder, where you can put in any parameters you want and it will spit out list of plants that meet those parameters. So let's say, you want to put in the criteria for your yard. You have a sunny yard, you have a shady yard, you have a wet yard, you have a dry yard. You can just add that in. You can put in, you want pretty plants, you want tall plants, you want a particular flower color, whatever it is, just put it in and then out will pop the results. So I clicked the edible box and then here's the results I got. 80 species. As I said, there's over 180 species that are native to this ecoregion that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative sample. So then I clicked on sweet fern, and here's the detail page for the sweet fern with the plant's range and more details about where it likes to grow and stuff like that. So if you haven't been to that site already, I encourage you to try that, and it will help ensure the success of what you try to plant in your own yard. All right. So with that, I think it's time to get into some of the details of some of the plants that are worth considering for your yard. All right, let's start with this one. Okay. Now, I'm going to guess that everybody in the audience knows that these are fiddleheads. Unfortunately, that is not enough to know that this is a safe and yummy fiddlehead to eat. So a mistake that novice foragers frequently make in eastern Massachusetts, it'll be the spring and they're walking along a trail and they see a bunch of ferns at this curled up early fiddlehead stage, and they say to themselves, oh, fiddleheads, boy, it looks an awful lot like what I've seen for sale in the stores. It must be the same thing. So they pick it and they bring it home and they cook it up and it tastes horrible. And they say, oh, where do we go wrong? Where they went wrong is they harvested the wrong species of fern. I only know of 2 species of fern that grow around here that taste good, and only one that's safe to eat in quantity, and that's this one. And this is indeed the ostrich fern or the fiddlehead fern. And this is the one that you do see for sale in the stores and fancy restaurant menus and stuff like that. Speaking of which, so I am not aware of anybody that is farming ostrich fern. So if you see an ostrich fern fiddlehead on a menu in a produce section, it was harvested from the wild. And that's not inherently bad. I do lots of picking from the wild and I'm happy that people do that. But unfortunately, some greedy people will pick more than they should for ecological reasons. So my recommended picking method on a clump of the ostrich fern fiddleheads is pick 1 or maybe 2 of the curled up parts per clump. That's it. Let the rest grow out. And that's a totally sustainable harvest. Unfortunately, though, what some greedy people will do is go into the woods and they'll find a fiddlehead patch. They'll pick every single fiddlehead they see. And that saps a lot of strength from the rhizome. You could actually kill a fern by harvesting it that hard. So just 1 or 2 per clump, that's fine. And other ways to identify the ostrich fern and distinguish it from other species of fern is these stems have a gouge that runs down the center. So if we cut the stem in cross section, you would see it forms a U shape. And then you see how the fiddleheads are growing in a vase-shaped clump. And also, there are these brown papery scales that wrap around the curled up part that flake off really easily with your fingers. So it's not like a wool, like a cinnamon fern. Oh, so here's where I want to mention traditional ecological knowledge again. So sometimes the knowledge is embedded in language. So you can see the vase shape there, the very circular nature of a mature ostrich fern fiddlehead. So here's what I learned from an ethnobotanist who's actually from the Pacific Northwest, but she shared this information that the Maliseet tribes, which is in New Brunswick and in Maine, their term for the ostrich fern fiddlehead is masos, which is the exact same term they use for the circling movement a dog makes before it lies down. And that is amazing. They notice the similarity there. That I would not have figured that out. And so so there's some wonderful traditional ecological knowledge built into the indigenous people's language, which is great to know. All right, so here is the typical habitat you're going to see for ostrich fern, and Merrimack River has some habitat. So if you go down to the Merrimack River floodplain in West Newbury, you can find some ostrich fern. I have seen it there. I've seen it in other places too, like further upstream up in Andover. And of course, you go further north into northern New England and Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. That's when you tend to really see a lot of the ostrich fern. Ostrich fern will grow in other places, but this is the habitat I will see it growing on its own in the wild. It doesn't like it really dry. It doesn't like it really rocky. So if you have relatively damp alluvial soil, you know, the silty soil, that's what they like. All right, so yeah, ostrich fern. Oh, here's the final slide I have just to help with the ID. So that really shows the vase-shaped clump as they're beginning to unroll like there. And then down here, you see the fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds, how the fern reproduces itself. And if you cut those in cross-section, you also see the U shape on the little stem. So you can remember all those rules. That is the ostrich fern. All right, so if you have ever bought ostrich ferns at the store and cooked them up and been not very impressed with them, you might think of this cooking method, which I analogize to sweet corn. You want to minimize the amount of time between when you get the corn and when you eat it. And so this was amply demonstrated by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us out to a patch of fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River in Northfield, Mass. And she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them. And they were truly exquisite that way. All right, so here's an example of how a homeowner has just deployed the ostrich fern fiddleheads in the landscape. And they fill in very well. And actually, that's something I should tip you off about. These will spread somewhat assertively. And so you probably don't want to plant an ostrich fern in a spot where when it spreads, that will bother you. Plant it in a place where you're hoping that it will spread and make a nice ground cover. So here's another view of the same thing. And I would wager that this homeowner has no clue that this is the edible ostrich fern growing here. And yet here it is, worthy of planting just to look at it, even if you never ate it. All right, so here's the marsh marigold. And this one grows along flowing streams in the spring. It's another spring ephemeral. And I put it in my show not so much because I think that everybody should be eating, picking marsh marigolds in the wild and stuff, although I certainly do it. Let me just close this beating control here. Okay. But this is one of our native species that was traditionally eaten by country people, like back before the Second World War, when people weren't able to just go to the store and buy leafy green vegetables any time of the year they wanted to. And so in the spring, they really look forward to eating green vegetables again. And it was the wild perennial herbaceous plants that produced those green vegetables early in the season before their gardens are really doing anything. And marsh marigold was one of those plants. So this one you also want to harvest very abstemiously. So I'm picking like just 2 or 3 leaves per plant. That's it. Leave the rest of the leaves attached to the plant. And by the way, you should gather the leaves before the flowers bloom. And then you have to boil them at least once. I would say maybe even change the water once and boil them again, and the leaves will not shrink and get all mushy on you even after all that boiling. And marsh marigold is a fun plant to grow from seed. So the seeds ripen in June. And this is what so after the flowers finish blooming, the seed heads form, and then they split open like this and the seeds start to fall out. So when the plants are getting close to this stage, and when you see the seed heads like that, that's when you want to visit it every day or so, because it will do this and lose all its seeds in just a few days. So you want to be on top of that, make sure you gather some. And then they will start growing right away as soon as they're sown, or you can store them and sow them later. And so let me see if so here's the shot from my mother's solar room, which I use as a de facto nursery. I'm sorry, greenhouse for my nursery. And here's where I've sowed some marsh marigold in January, and they were already doing well a couple months later. And those got potted out and put outside once the weather got nice. All right, so this is the common milkweed. This is the only milkweed that's edible by people. So swamp milkweed, butterfly weed, none of the other milkweeds are edible by people. And I will talk about the ecological importance of this plant, but let's talk about how humans can eat it. So there's a chapter on milkweed in my book, and the subtitle of the chapter is "A Procrastinating Forager's Dream Food," because there's at least 4 edible stages to the plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develops. So by this time of year, by late September, all those stages have gone by. But in the spring, when the shoots come up, you can eat the entire shoot. And there's a special cooking method I'm going to teach you that applies to all the milkweed parts I'm about to tell you about. So just wait for that. So then when the shoots get about a foot tall, they start getting too stiff and woody to enjoy, but that you can pick the leaves off the tips of the older shoots. And then the third stage are these flower buds, and they're in their nice tight green cluster like they are in this photo here. They're kind of like broccoli florets. You can cook them up. And let me just show you what that looks like. Oh, let me just say the cooking method I use for all these milkweed parts is I boil whatever milkweed part I'm cooking for 7 minutes. And that is an adequate amount of cooking. And so, yeah, so look at these milkweed buds in this bowl here. These have been boiled for 7 minutes. And look how well they held up. If anything, they look even nicer than they did when they were attached to the plant. And one of the ways you can use them is this recipe, which is from my book. This is milkweed egg puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole. Then the milkweed pods are also edible. When they're up to 1 inch long, you can boil them for 7 minutes, and then the texture and the flavor is really similar to green beans. All right, so now let's talk about the ecological point. So this is one of our native milkweeds that the monarch butterflies lay their eggs on, and here's a monarch caterpillar to remind us of this. So it is really important to make sure there's lots of milkweed plants around. There's a plant I'm actively propagating in my nursery and planting out on my sites, so you can grow it from existing roots or from seed. It's not hard. And let me tell you how I'm walking the walk right at my own house. So here's my house right here in the back. Here's my car. Here's my boat. And then here's the blueberry bushes we have growing in the driveway next to our house. And we allow the milkweed plants to also grow there too. And then we harvest them and eat them and dig them up and transplant them and plant them out on other sites and doing all that too. In addition to that, the monarch butterflies have found our milkweed. And here I've got nets covering the blueberries, so I get some fruit and the birds don't get all of them. And yeah, the milkweed, monarch butterflies lay the eggs on the milkweed, and then the caterpillars grow. And then here we found, in evidence of that, we found a chrysalis attached to our garage door. In fact, fortunately, it attached to one of the hinges. So when the door went up and down, the chrysalis just went for a little ride. And it was there for 2 weeks. And then one day we went out, and this was clear, and it was empty, and the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. Yeah, so you can grow milkweed in your own yard. But here's a very simple thing you can do if you're interested in helping to propagate some milkweed out there. So as you're traveling around and you see patches of milkweed right now, some of those pods will have ripened and split open, and you see the white parachute business attached to the seeds showing from the split open pods. So you can gather a few of those pods and just throw them in your car. And as you're traveling around, if you see some nice habitat from milkweed plants, like the edge of a bike path or a school ball field or something like that with no milkweed plants in there, just release those parachutes and help start a new milkweed colony. All right, so here is our native basswood tree. This is Tilia americana. There's a closely related Tilia cordata that is edible the same way. That's a European plant that's deployed as a street tree. This is our native tree. And the young leaves are edible straight into your mouth. When they first come out in the spring, they'll be very tender and kind of a yellowish green in color. And then the flowers are edible too, and you make a tea from the flowers. And the tea you make from the flowers has a wonderful lemon honey flavor, and it has 2 medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So herbalists really love to recommend this plant to their clients. And when people think about plants that are valuable for pollinators, I think they tend to think of the herbaceous perennial species like the goldenrods, for example. But basswood is an example of a tree, and this can be a tree 40 feet, 50 feet tall. And when the flowers are blooming, they're covered with blossom. When the trees are blooming, have blooming flowers on them, the trees are covered with hundreds and hundreds of flowers. And you can actually hear the tree before you see it, because there's so many bees and buzzing insects visiting those flowers. You can hear their buzzing before you actually see the tree. Okay, so here is sassafras, and sassafras is quite common in the North Shore. It's exceedingly easy to recognize because it has leaves with 3 different shapes: no thumbs, 1 thumb, and 2 thumbs, all in the same plant. It's the only plant that does that. And there's 2 basic flavors in sassafras. So let's talk about the sassafras roots, and they have the very familiar root beer flavor. And but I should just tell you that saffrol, an essential oil that's in that root beer flavor, the Food and Drug Administration thinks that might be carcinogenics. They've actually banned saffrol-containing sassafras root products in the food supply, and this ban is like over 50 years old. It's still in effect. And so if you're one of those people, oh, by the way, I should mention that I and other people I know that teach foraging, we want to, give our students accurate information. So we've searched high and low to find any, even anecdotal examples of humans getting cancer from sassafras. We haven't found any. But even though, if all you need to know is the Food and Drug Administration thinks that the saffrol might be carcinogenic and you decide not to use the sassafras roots, I totally support you in that. In fact, I totally support you wherever your comfort level is about anything I'm talking about tonight. So whether you're not sure if you've made the correct ID on a plant, whether you're not sure that you're gathering from an uncontaminated area that's not exposed to contaminants in the soil or herbicides or something like that, you chicken out and you don't eat something, I think that's pretty sensible. But I will tell you, sassafras is very tasty. Native Americans used it quite a bit, still use it. In my book, I've got a recipe for sassafras candy, which are like the root beer barrels used to buy at the penny candy store, only even stronger because there's little bits of root bark embedded in the candy. All right, but let's talk about the other edible part on a sassafras plant, and that are the young leaves. The young sassafras leaves are edible straight into your mouth if you want. They have a nice flavor. Or they can be dried and used to make filet powder. So that's what filet powder is. It's dried powdered sassafras leaves. And so in the spring, when the leaves are small, about 1 inch long, is the right time to gather them and just spread them out on a cookie sheet, allow them to dry, pulverize them, just sift out any fibers, put that powder into a salt or pepper type shaker, and then just add it to your food near the end to flavor and thicken it. And that is filet powder. And the filet powder doesn't have any saffrol in it. All right, and another reason you might want to plant sassafras in your yard, it's a totally underappreciated fall foliage tree. It is truly gorgeous. All right, so here is the Amelanchier, or the Juneberry plant, also called shadbush or serviceberry, Saskatoon, many names. We have at least 8 species that are native to some part of New England, and they hybridize. So these are very hard to tell them apart. You don't really need to, though, at least in terms of eating them, because all the fruit's edible. So I tend to lump them together. If you're looking for them in the wild, the best time to look for them is April, when the plants are blooming, because they're one of our earliest bloomers. Remember where that tree is, and then go back in June to look for the fruit, because the fruit will look like this when it's ripe. And so this fruit right here, this reddish one, is like a day or two short of being ripe. It's these purpley ones that are fully ripe. And if you eat one of those, even though they look a lot like blueberries, they really don't taste like blueberries at all. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds. And they're related to cherries and almonds. They're all related plants in the rose family. So Juneberries are great for stuffing your face right by the tree. In my book, I've got a recipe for Juneberry muffins where you can use fresh fruit, dried fruit, or frozen fruit. Works good all 3 ways. And also a recipe for fruit nut granola using dried Juneberries. Okay, but this is also a popular fruit with songbirds. And so you might say to yourself, oh, I don't want to take the food away from the birds. Well, okay, but a typical Juneberry plant is 12 feet tall. And when the fruit is ripe, it's ripe at the top, it's ripe at the bottom. So the songbirds can fly up in the upper branches, enjoy that fruit. You can pick the fruit from the lower branches, and there's plenty to go around, and you can all pig out and have a great time. So anyway, although Juneberries do readily grow in the wild, like I've seen them, if you go paddling on the Parker River, the freshwater section of the Parker River in the spring, you often see blooming shadbush Juneberry plants right along the river in that paddle, which is nice to see. Okay, so, but this plant, the genus Amelanchier plants, are frequently deployed in landscapes, like in parks and other landscapes, because of the early bloom, I suspect, is a nice aesthetic feature. And so you don't have to go off into nature to find these. You can find them in local parks. Like, for example, this photo I took at Paul Revere Park in Charlestown, which was right around the corner from where my office was in downtown Boston when I was working. I would go to Paul Revere Park, a DCR property, on my lunch hour and pick quarts of the Juneberry fruit. Now, most of these I would eat, but a lot of them I would save the seeds and try to propagate the plant from the seeds. So I'll get into details about that in just a second. But let me just tell you that Juneberry makes excellent strudels. That's one of the ways I would use the fruit. Okay, so growing the Juneberry is really easy. What I did is from some of those fruit, I would eat the pulp of the fruit, but spit the seeds into my hand. Ordinarily, you eat the seeds, but I would spit the seeds into my hand and then store them in a plastic bag and throw them in my fridge, which is a process called stratification. It's basically imitating winter. A lot of our native seeds need to go through a stratification process in order to break their dormancy. And this is an evolutionary adaptation so the seed doesn't sprout like in the fall where the itty bitty plants would have to endure a harsh winter. So in order to spare them, the seeds have these little timers built in where they'll just bide their time in the fridge until it's time to sprout, which is supposed to correspond to spring. But occasionally what can happen with the Amelanchier seeds, and I've noticed this with other plants in the rose family, is the seeds are precocious. They start sprouting early. And if that happens in your stratification fridge, you need to sow the seed right away because otherwise it'll die. And so fortunately, in my mother's solar room, I would sow the seeds and get the plants. And I now have at least 24 over 2 foot tall Juneberry plants in my nursery that I grew from seeds, from fruit I gathered in the park and saved the seeds. All right, so wild strawberry also grows very easily from seed. And I would wager everybody taking part in the Zoom presentation tonight has some place in their property where they could fit in some wild strawberries. So if you've got any place where there's a sunny area where there's grass, like a lawn, or a place where there's low growing stuff, you could plant the strawberries there. They don't mind getting mowed. They don't mind getting stepped on. You have these pretty little white flowers in the spring that the pollinators will visit. And then the fruit comes out in late June, and it is admittedly small, but they are truly delectable. And you can also make tea from strawberry leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea you make from the leaves does taste at least vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some strawberry leaf tea. All right, and I like to share seed when I can with groups that will use it. So here's an example from out Western Mass. So here's Miss Hall School, girls' school out in Pittsfield, where they have a greenhouse on campus. And as part of the education, the girls would learn how to propagate plants. And they would traditionally sow things like broccoli and then have a seedling sale in the spring where they would sell their little broccoli starts to homeowners in the area. So I said, well, I've got wild strawberry seed. How about if you grow them? And so I brought them some strawberry seed, and you can see that they repurposed the clamshell containers that the fruit is coming from in the store anyway, filled that with growing medium, just sprinkled the strawberry seeds in there and grew it in their greenhouse. And they had plants that were big enough to sell with their vegetable starts in the spring to the homeowners who were buying plants for the garden. And they sold really well. So I think that's, all the farms that are doing that growing vegetable starts, I encourage them to get into wild strawberry plants too, and branch out that way. All right, so another plant that does really well in lawns is this violet. This is the dooryard violet. This is the most common violet, the one with the glossy heart-shaped leaves and the purple flowers. And the leaves are edible fresh or cooked, the raw or cooked. The flowers are edible raw like that, or you can also candy them and use them for decorations like on this black walnut cake. And I haven't figured out how to grow violets from seed, but I have so many in my backyard that I just dig up a whole bunch, pot them up, and then plant them out in sites that don't have them. And you can't even tell in my yard that any violets were taken because it's a very prolifically spreading plant there. All right, so now we're looking at plants in the summer, and this is I would argue our most attractive plant in the rubus genus, and this is flowering raspberry. So if you've got habitat that is dappled sunlight, a slopey thing where it's damp, that is ideally where flowering raspberry is going to be the happiest. And these flowers are almost 2 inches across. That's a really showy flower for a raspberry plant. And these enormous maple-like leaves are fun to look at. And the stems don't have thorns. So this is a plant that might be worth planting in your yard, even if you never ate it, just to look at it. So here's what the fruit looks like. And I will admit that a regular red raspberry is probably a tastier fruit than these flowering raspberries, but because it's juicier, but these raspberry pulp is a little bit on the dry side, but the flavor is still nice. They're worth picking and eating. All right, so black raspberry is, I don't need to tell you what to do with black raspberry fruit. I'm sure you can figure that out on your own. So one of the neat visual attributes that black raspberry does that's worth considering for your yard is the off-season appearance of the plant, is the canes turn this wonderful purpley color. And it'll be this way all through the fall, winter, into the following spring. And so that's a fun thing to look at. And even when the snow comes, and you might be out like cross country skiing, walking your dog in February, if you see purple color thorny canes and it shows up really well against the snow, that's black raspberry. Remember that spot and then go back in late June, early July to pick the fruit. All right, so here's the common elderberry plant. The ideal habitat for the common elderberry is open, damp, meadowy habitat. That's where it's going to be the happiest. Although it will grow in other places. You plant it in an open, meadowy area that's damp. That's where it's really going to thrive. And now, elder flowers are edible, and some people will make a drink from them. And there's an alcoholic version and a non-alcoholic version. The problem is that if you pick the flowers off the plant, you're not going to get any fruit on that plant because you have to leave the flowers on the plant to get the fruit. So I tend to leave the flowers on the plant to get the fruit. But I just want to use the common elderberry plant to underscore a point I made at the beginning of the talk, which is that as I'm sure just about everybody in this audience knows, that insects rely upon native plants for some or all their important portion of their life cycle. So let's talk about in the context of this critter right here, the elderberry borer beetle. It's a cool looking beetle, spends most of its life associated with elderberry plants. So the adult beetles mate on the elderberry plants. The female beetles lay their eggs in the elderberry plants. The larvae live inside the elderberry plants, and they're not harming the plants. The beetle larvae and the plants are under dynamic equilibrium, so they're both doing fine. And so that's a good indication for why it's important to have native plants out there, because it's supporting these really wonderful insects. All right, so if the flowers stay on the plant, which is what I tend to do, then eventually you get this fruit. And this photo isn't upside down. This is the ripe fruit clusters tend to hang down from the weight of the fruit, hang upside down like this. Now, I understand you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you dry them first or you cook them first, then they're safe to eat as many as you want. Right. And let me just say, you can grow elderberries just by taking an elderberry branch and sticking it in the ground. I haven't done this, but I understand they'll root rather readily. So you could grow them that way. But you have probably heard, and I am among the believers about this, that if you can grow plants from seed, ideally, that's the best way to do it, because then you're preserving the genetic diversity. If you just take a cutting from a plant, stick it in the ground, you're basically cloning the plant. This way, each plant that grows from each individual seed is going to have its own unique DNA, which makes the population more resistant and adaptable to changes like might be brought on by climate changes to our climate in this area. So seed grown is great. You can definitely do that with elderberries. So here I'm using my mother's solar room just to get an early start in January, but you could absolutely sow these outside if you wanted to. And so here's the plant growing in January, and then by March it started growing out in a bigger pot. You could see the roots coming out of the bottom of the pot. And those of you that grow plants in pots, when the roots start growing out the bottom, it's time to think about taking the plants out of the pot. And in this case, I just punted and put the entire contents of this pot into a bigger pot and just let it keep growing. And then eventually these got pulled out and each given their own individual pot, and they're getting big enough now that I can plant them out on the landscape. All right, so here's one of our native mints. This is Monarda fistulosa, or wild bergamot. And this one, the leaves taste like oregano. So you could use it instead of oregano, like in soups, omelets, casserole, sausage making, pizza topping, stuff like that. And so here's another plant that's highly regarded by folks that want to plant for pollinators. And I'm sure in some cases they're putting this in and have no idea it's edible by people too, but it is. And and this one's also easy to grow from seed. Okay, and here's another native mint. This is Pycnanthemum muticum, which has a more of a pepperminty, spearminty flavor. So the Pycnanthemum muticum would be a better plant for mint tea than I think that the Monarda fistulosa would be. And here's a close-up of it. And this one, I have to say, in my nursery, I see more and more diverse insects visiting these flowers than anything else I'm growing, including this great blue wasp, which is a lot of fun to see visiting your flowers. All right, so here is one of our native species that the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. It's sweet goldenrod. It is a licorice flavored goldenrod. So the leaves and the flowers smell and taste like licorice. So you just brew a tea, you just, put the flowers or the leaves in a mug, pour the hot water on it, let it steep for a few minutes, and there's your licorice flavored tea. It's really fun. And this is a very, very easy plant to grow from seed. And I know for sure that it doesn't need stratification. And the way I found this out is I bought some plugs from the New England Wildflower Society. They bloomed, they went to seed. And that same season, later on that season, I was getting little baby plants growing from the seed that have fallen off the flowers that have formed seed heads. So if you see that, for sure it's a plant that doesn't need stratification. All right, so here's sweet fern. This is a plant I haven't attempted to grow from seed yet, but I hope to soon. And there's another one of our native species the colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era that would just steep the leaves in hot water for a few minutes. And these little seeds inside the burrs are edible, and that's what you gather to try to propagate the plants. And this plant likes sunny, dry soil and has no trouble growing in nutrient poor soil, like really sandy or gravelly, because it can do what plants in the pea family does. It has the nitrogen fixing nodules on its root system, so it can grow in the nutrient poor soil, like what you'd have in a gravel pit. All right, so here is spicebush, another one of our native species the colonists made tea from. They just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes. So spicebush plants come in male and females. So if you want a plant with berries, you need to grow a female. Unfortunately, most nurseries that carry this plant don't know what the sex of the spicebush plants are. So if that's the case where you're trying to source these plants, then you just have to put in as many as you have room for, and that will just increase your odds that you'll get at least one female plant if you do that. And so you can make tea just by steeping the twigs in hot water for a few minutes. The leaves are aromatic too. The main part I'm gathering to eat on a spicebush, these berries, and I dry them, which is just spreading them out on a cookie sheet for several weeks. And this is what they'll look like. So they lose the beautiful red color and they get kind of wrinkly. But once they're dry like this, you can store them in your pantry in a glass jar, and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then when you're ready to use them, you just grind up a few with a mortar and pestle just to get that nice savory flavor in there. Now, I say savory flavor because that's my opinion of what spicebush berries taste like. All the books I've ever read about spicebush say it's an allspice substitute. And I have to disagree because I find allspice to be a sweet, kind of like a clovey spice. And the spicebush berries are a savory spice, like black pepper or Szechuan peppercorn. So that's how I would use them. Okay, but before you gather any spicebush berries from the wild, I need to tell you that these berries, because they're high in vegetable fats, they're very valuable food for birds, especially the migrating songbirds that need to fatten up before their southward migration. So they'll seek out the spicebush berries for that purpose. So if you are picking berries in the wild, it's important to leave lots of berries on the plant so the birds can get all they need. So I have grown spicebush from seed. You do not want to let the seed dry because it will lose its viability. So like the Monarda fistulosa that I just showed you, the wild bergamot, or the sweet goldenrod, those seeds, you can absolutely allow them to dry, will not lose their viability at all. But a lot of woodland species like this spicebush, these seeds need to be kept moist or they'll lose their viability. Yes, so you can just, so you dry the berries to eat them, but if you want to propagate seeds from them, do not dry them. All right, so this part will rot off. You clean that off, then you have these seeds right there, and then you sow them. And But here is how I sow them. And this is something I know from bitter experience, that if you don't do this, say goodbye to your spice bush plants, because the ravenous rodents will dig them up to eat the remaining seed that's still in the ground, even after it is sprouted and little plants are growing. So avoid the mistake I made and get a roll of this hardware cloth. And I tend to use it over just about everything I'm sowing in my nursery, even including like the small seed like the wild bergamot or the sweet goldenrod, because uh, I I think that the squirrels and chipmunks are just curious, and they're just they see any bare soil, they want to dig in it just to see what's there, and they're going to dislodge your seeds if they can get at them. So I recommend the hardware cloth very highly. Okay, and another reason you might want to plant spice bush in your yard is because it is the host plant, along with sassafras, for this really cool critter called the spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. All right, so after this caterpillar first hatches from an egg, it's early instars. So this is about 1/2 inch long. It looks just like bird poop. So that's an ingenious disguise. And then as it gets bigger, it develops these big fake eye patches. The real eyes are down here. These are fake eye patches where the caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake. And then even at the pupa stage down here, you can see that it looks just like a dry leaf. So isn't it amazing how this organism has evolved these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? All right, so all right, here is wintergreen, and the wintergreen plants and the berries have the oil of wintergreen flavor in them, and you can make a tea from the leaves, especially these young unrolling leaves. And this is like late June, early July is when the best time to gather those. But if I want to make a wintergreen flavored drink, I tend to make it from the twigs of black or yellow birch. So here's a black birch twig right here. You can do this any time of year. You just peel the twig and put the peelings and the peeled twigs in a glass jar. So like here, and you just let it sit around for an hour, and that's it. So don't heat it up. Don't use hot water or boiling water from your kettle to try and make a wintergreen flavored tea, because oil of wintergreen is very volatile, which means it's easily driven off by heat. And so if you attempt to make the tea that way, your kitchen will smell great, but there'll be no flavor left in your teacup. And this text here tells you that you can tap black birch, yellow birch trees, actually any species of birch, as long as it's big enough in diameter, and tap to extract the sap and boil that down to make a molasses type product. All right, and it is fun to propagate birch trees from seed. And the really fun part is the collecting it, because you can do it in the middle of the winter time, because these strobles that have the seed start dropping the seed in the fall through the winter. So if you go out after a snowfall and you ski or snowshoe underneath where the black or yellow birch trees are dropping their seeds, you'll see them just on the surface of the snow that you're seeing here. And then you can sow them right on the surface of the ground, because they actually need light to germinate. And so here we are, the birch trees in my nursery, and these are over 2 feet tall now in my nursery that I grew from seed I gathered when I was cross-country skiing. All right, so here is a plant that I hope everybody should know what it is. Yesterday, when I gave this talk to 40 people in Southington, Connecticut, not one person knew what it was, even after I gave them the hint of a boardwalk going over a dune. I said, does that help you? It did not help them. So I had to just tell them that these are indeed beach plums. And for some of you, perhaps, that don't know this already, this might be the most valuable piece of information you're going to get the entire slideshow. And that is how to recognize, how to find beach plums. And the big hint is to look for them in the spring when they're blooming. And of course, you know where they grow. Need I say nothing else than Plum Island? Yes, Plum Island, named for beach plums. And unfortunately, they now have a lottery system. It used to be able to anyone could get a free permit from the National Wildlife Refuge. Now they have a lottery system. I guess they have more demand for the beach plums than they have permits to give out. But if you're interested, that's one place for sure where beach plums grow, and hopefully you'll win the lottery and you'll get permission to pick them. All right, but generically, if you want to know where beach plums are growing in the landscape, look for them in May when the plants are blooming, because the blossoms stand out really well against the drabber foliage that you tend to see in the dunes where they are. But you can plant these plants in your own yard. I'll get into those details in just a second. So yes, so it's good to know where beach plums are growing, because when the fruit is ripe, it's this purple color. There's occasionally an orange one, but I usually see it as purple. And there's a hard color to see at a distance. You have to be practically standing right next to the bush to see if there's any fruit on there. So it's good to know where the bushes are in advance, so you know when to visit them. And when do you visit them? Labor Day weekend is the reliable time to look for beach plums. Sometimes before, sometimes after, but Labor Day weekend should be good for you. All right, and beach plums do not have to grow near the ocean. So here's a photo I took from Worcester County, where I was traveling along a road in the spring and I saw some bushes that looked just like beach plums. And I said, wait a minute, those are beach plums. I got to go back in September and visit them and see if they in fact have fruit. And so these are fruit I picked from plants many miles inland. Henry David Thoreau observed the fact that beach plums grew in places other than right along the coastline in conditions that they liked. And basically, if you have a sunny spot with fairly well-drained soil, you should be able to grow beach plums. The important thing is plant at least two, because although beach plums don't come in male and female plants like the spice bush does, they're not self-fertile. So you have to have at least two plants to have the pollinators fly back and forth between one and the other so that your flowers get pollinated. All right, and of course, there's wonderful things you can do with beach plums. Beach plum jam is a traditional thing, and you don't have to just put that on toast. You can make stuff with the jam, like these rugula right here are really yummy. Okay, and as I said, there's an orange fruited beach plum too, which is at least as good as the purple fruited ones. And right now I have a trial in my nursery where I've gathered some fruits and I ate the fruits, but I saved all the pits and I've sown the pits, and I have seedling plants in my nursery that were grown from these yellowy orange fruits. And my guess is that when those plants are big enough to start producing fruit on their own, they'll be the orange yellowy fruits, because it's actually a subspecies of the Prunus marinima. Okay, so every beach plum I pick, I save the pit and I try to grow a plant from the pit. And so far I have over 200 plants in my nursery that I grew exactly that way from pits. And so you can stratify them, store them in a plastic bag in your fridge, and then sometimes they'll sprout on you, and then you have to sow them right away. And so now I have many beach plums in my nursery that I grew exactly that way. Okay, so now for a different yard, a yard that's shady and damp, you might want to consider May apples. So this is a species I tend to not see so much in New England, although it is native here. Where you're really going to run into beach plums in the woods is further south, like down in Pennsylvania, where it could be a very common ground cover. But it does well up here. In fact, some people would say it does too well, that this is a plant that can spread vegetatively by its robust root systems. And so it is likely to spread if it's happy. So just be aware of that. If you're going to deploy it in your garden, plant it in a place where when it spreads, which is likely to do, that doesn't bother you, and in fact you like it. So it's called Mayapple because the flowers come out in May and they occur in the crotch between the two leaves that are connected to each other in a V shape, and that's where the fruit forms. And here's the fruit right here, and the fruit is ripe at the end of August, beginning of September, and it has to be this deep yellow color. And often these have fallen off the plant or laying on the ground, or the entire plant has senesced where the leaves have turned brown and just flopped over in the ground with the ripe fruit still attached. And an unripe mayapple will not taste good, and it's actually slightly poisonous, so you don't want to eat those. So bite into it. If it tastes good and it's nice and ripe, it has a very tropical flavor, kind of like a guava. So they're really nice. Okay, so there are no poisonous species of viburnum, I'm happy to tell you. They're not all edible by people, like arrowwood berries, Viburnum dentanum fruit doesn't taste good. Maple leaf viburnum fruit doesn't taste good. But there's several that do taste good, including the nanny berry. So this is ripe in September. So it's just, it's still on the plants now, but it's pretty much fallen off. A week or two earlier would have been better. And then there's the wild raisin that I'm still seeing on the plants a little bit. And then there's also hobblebush, which does grow in Essex County. So for example, Ravenswood in Gloucester has hobblebush. And I'm sorry I didn't put it in my show tonight, because it's just that in Essex County, you probably want to have a cool north-facing slope in order to have the hobblebush be happy, because it's a plant that is more common in northern New England. It's actually one of our species that's native to Essex County that I think could be possibly vulnerable to climate change. If it continues to warm up here in Essex County, it might get too warm for the hobblebush, and the species might retreat northward. Its natural range. But I encourage you to try planting it. And it's tricky to find the plants, and it's hard to grow this from seed. I keep trying. I haven't succeeded yet, but I keep trying. I pick the fruit, save the seeds, and sow them. All right, so let's talk about sumac. So anybody that has been worried about sumacs that have upright clusters of red berries because you think it's poison sumac, you were wrong. This is what poison sumac berries look like. They're very loose, drooping clusters of white berries. So any sumac with these clusters of red berries, like the staghorn sumac, it's not only not poison sumac, it's an edible sumac. So this would be staghorn sumac or wing sumac or smooth sumac. They all grow in Essex County. And you might say, well, I don't have a yard big enough for sumac because it's going to spread. And yes, it does spread vegetatively. And so, yeah, this would be a good thing deployed if you've got some acreage and you've got like an edge of a field where you plant the sumac on the edge. And if the field is getting mowed periodically, that's going to control the sumac. It's just going to grow in the field edge that isn't getting mowed. So this is a wonderfully edible plant, and you make a drink from the berries. And this is all described in my book, but I'll just tell you how to do it. So you gather up the fruit and you put it in a bowl with some water, and you just rub it to get the flavor off the berries into the water. The water will turn this pinkish orange color. Fish out the berries. You're done with them. Take the liquid, pour it through any kind of a filter like a paper towel, and then you can drink it hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. I typically drink it cold and sweetened like pink lemonade. And so there it is. And the entire time it takes from gathering the fruit off the plant to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. All right, and all this text is just warning you not to put the sumac seeds in your compost pile unless you want to be picking out baby sumac plants for, well, at least 8 years. I think it's going to keep going because I'm still doing it this year too. So, I mean, I repot those sumac plants and, add them to my nursery, and I plant them out in appropriate spots. But you might get tired of running into sumac plants in, your raised beds where your tomatoes are trying to grow. All right, and sumac is an underappreciated fall foliage plant. All right, so we've got a couple different kinds of grapevines. And once again, you might say, oh, I don't want a grapevine because it's going to clamber over all my other plants and I'm not going to like that. And if that's your case, yeah, don't plant a grapevine. But if you have space for a vine, I think it's really fun. We've got 2 species that are yummy, although for different purposes. This is the Vitis labrusca, or the fox grape. And this is the one that produces the large purple grapes that can get as an inch diameter, and you often smell them before you see them when they're ripe. And although there are a few still out now, the season is pretty much gone by for the fox grape here in Massachusetts. So you just have to file that information away for future reference. And, I am, in a typical year, I'm filling baskets up with the fox grape fruit, and I typically make sorbet from it. And if this were a live program, that might have been one of the things I would have fed you. But it also makes a really delicious grape cheesecake. So the other species I also see in Essex County is the Riverside grape. And these leaves are smooth and green on the underside. I forgot to say that on the fox grape leaves, the leaves are finely wool in the underside, and that color is usually white, and it turns usually a coppery color by the time the grapes are ripe. But the Riverside grape leaves are smooth on the underside, and I'll show that better in the next photo. But first, let me say, although you can see that this plant also produces grapes too, they're smaller, they're kind of musky flavored, they're not quite as good as the grapes that you'd get from the fox grape. But some people think the Riverside grape is the best grape leaf for stuffing. And this would be in the spring into the early summer. So like June and early July, you see that the Riverside grape leaves are smooth and green on the underside, and they're quite delicate. So that's the kind I've been using for stuffing. And I find that you only have to blanch them, drop them into boiling water for 20 seconds, and that's enough to prevent them from tearing. And then you just make your stuffed grape leaves, and it's really fun. It's the kind of thing you can serve to company, and they'll be really impressed when they find out that they're wild grape leaves that you picked and stuffed yourself. All right, so we've got two different species of hazelnuts that grow native to Massachusetts. There's a common hazelnut and the beaked hazelnut, and the only difference is the appearance of the husk surrounding the nut. So here's what hazelnuts look like when they drop out of the husk, or when the entire husk falls off the ground. So if you want to gather these from the wild, and also I give you this advice if you grow hazelnuts in your yard and you want to get some nuts for yourself for eating, you need to not wait until the nuts fall on the ground, because if you wait, the squirrels and chipmunks will get them all before you do. So you want to pick them as close to ripe as possible, but still attached to the plant. And I do that when I'm seeing a lot of brown on the husks, like these down here or these up here. So pick them slightly underripe, spread them out with a husk still attached to the nut on a piece of newspaper in your garage, and let them sit there for a couple of weeks. And then the nut will continue to ripen, and then this husk will turn brown, and then it's easy to separate the husk from the nuts. And then there's also the beaked hazelnut. This also grows in Massachusetts. And this one has this strange thing sticking out that looks like a bird's beak. Okay, so the point down here is actually true for all nuts. So all nuts are hydrophilic, which means you can't let them grow out, dry out, or they'll lose their viability. So if you're going to sow a hazelnut, you need to store them in a plastic bag and stratify them, or sow it in the ground like it happens naturally when the squirrels or chipmunks bury some nuts in the ground, intending to dig them up later. But thankfully, there's some that are forgetful and they miss some, and those go into our new plants. And in the presence of nut trees in our landscape is largely due to forgetful squirrels and chipmunks. So I'm very grateful for that. So, but once again, if you sow a nut, you have to protect it from the rodents. So I look for hazelnuts under power lines, and I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's just all the sun they're getting, and the fact that if it's one of those wide power line corridors, it's hard for a squirrel and chipmunk to work those bushes all the time, because that's a kind of a scary place for them. There's hawks and snakes and foxes and other things that would happily eat them. They can see them in places like that. And so I find that I am able to find more nuts in a place like that. And by the way, this isn't true for all power companies in Massachusetts, but I have definitely noticed, including in Essex County, some of the power line companies like National Grid that has lines there, if they see hazelnuts growing underneath their power lines, they tend to leave them there. They're not threatened by the hazelnuts, because hazelnuts, although it looks like they're touching the wires here, this bush is only 12 feet tall. These wires are like 60 feet up in the air. Hazelnuts will never get tall enough to short out the wires. And where hazelnuts are growing, they form these really dense thickets that inhibit the growth of the other trees like the oaks and the maples that could eventually get tall enough to short out the wires. So yeah, so that's a good place to look for them. Okay, so acorns are edible. All oak trees produce acorns, and all acorns are edible by people. The question is just how much tannic acid is in the acorns. And so, of course, those of you that are Doug Talmy fans know he's very high in oak trees and just wrote a book about oaks extolling their virtues. I haven't read the book, but I'm going to guess that he doesn't talk about people eating oak tree, eating acorns, which is a shame, because in a massed year like this one appears to be, at least for some oak trees, where there are thousands of nuts on the ground, and you could take your life in your hands trying to walk from your car to your house. If you've got an oak tree, tripping on all those acorns on the ground, there's definitely enough for the squirrels to get what they need and for people to eat some too. And you do have to leach the tannic acid out to make them palatable by people. And in general, it's the leaves from the white oak acorn group, like white oak, post oak, chestnut oak, bur oak, swamp white oak, that have lower levels of tannic acid in the acorns. So there's less processing required to make the acorns palatable. But some people have red oak acorns, and they do it with those, which is fine. Okay, now the tricky thing with white oak acorns is they start to sprout more or less within a week or so after they hit the ground. And so these acorns cannot be stratified. You can't store them in the fridge without them spoiling. So you need to sow them within a couple of weeks of gathering them, otherwise they'll die on you. So here I made an attempt to store some white oak acorns, and the roots popped out and they just rotted right off. So that does not work. You have to sow them in the fall. All right, so here's the shagbark hickory. This is my #1 favorite edible species out of everything I talked about in this talk, out of all the plants that are out there. And shagbark hickory nuts are in season right now. So I am a happy camper and I love to go out and gather them. So here is the tree, and this isn't a seasonal phenomenon. The bark always looks like this. So I'm paying attention where these trees are year round and remembering where they are, and then going back from like the first day of fall until the end of October. That's the time when you're going to find shagbark hickories. And the best time is in the middle of that period. So like first, second week October is when you should be able to find shagbark hickory nuts. And yeah, so here's Pauca hicora. This is the traditional Native American preparation for shagbark hickories. Very tasty. Okay, so it's very, very common that I'm going to have baskets full of hickory nuts in my car this time of year. And there is this four-parted husk that comes off relatively easily. Sometimes just the impact of the nut falling off the tree and hitting the ground just bursts this the husk right off, and then you're just finding the shells. And you have to crack these open to get the nut meats. And see, there's the nut meats right there. And they taste, if you've never had a hickory nut, it tastes like a walnut that's been lightly sprayed with maple syrup. They're really yummy. And here's my maple hickory nut pie. The recipe's in my book, and virtually everybody I feed this to prefer this over pecan pie. And so I encourage you to try it. All right, here's several different cookies I make from hickory nuts. Were this to be a live program, I probably would have brought one of these cookies for you to try. All right, and of course, I'm gathering a lot of hickory nuts to eat them, but then I also propagate hickory trees with some of the nuts too. And once again, don't let the nuts you want to propagate trees from dry out. You do want to let them dry out if you're going to eat them, because they're easier to shell that way. But if you're going to propagate trees in them, stratify them or sow them in the fall. And yes, I use these 14-inch pots because hickories get a big taproot. And yeah, there's the hardware cloth again I've deployed as a covering in the pots to prevent the squirrels and chipmunks from digging those up. And I should tell you that although these right here don't have it, I now use cross wiring to really wire these things in there, because I had the squirrels and chipmunks figured out they could just pry these off and eat the nuts that way. So now I wire these in, and then you know, the trees can, the seedling trees can grow up through the holes in the mesh, but eventually you might have to get some tin snips and cut the mesh enough to extract the plants from the protective covering. All right, so black walnuts will be in season soon. You don't have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then you'll see them just piled up along the roadside. I know you have these in West Newbury. I've seen them piled up right along Route 113. So I know you have them. And yes, it is a task to get the outer part off. It's messy. You can stain your fingers brown. So you need to do that, though. And then once you do that, you have these nuts, which the next challenge is to get these open, because they will break most conventional nut crackers. So you can use a hammer, or a vise works well if you have a vise in your tool shed or your garage. Here's the device I use. I got this from a company in Oklahoma, and this works really well. And you get big pieces out this way. And black walnut, I think a shagbark hickory nut is a better tasting nut just into your mouth, just plain, than a black walnut is. But black walnuts pair really well with honey. And so black walnut baklava or black walnut honey squares. This is a recipe I frequently bring to my in-person programs. Are really yummy. Okay, so pawpaws. Here's a species that you won't find usually in the wild in Massachusetts, because its native range is way to the south and west of here, like the Ohio River Valley. But recently, I found, it was just last year, I found a patch of pawpaws growing in Lexington, Mass, right near the Minuteman bike path. Hundreds of plants looking just like a natural patch like I had seen, you know, when I lived in Southern Ohio, with fruit, with viable fruit, with viable seeds in it, and tasty pulp. And so, you know, if you want to do a little edible landscaping with native species and push the envelope a little bit, you could try growing a pawpaw. With the climate getting increasingly hospitable for more southerly, natural southerly species like this, I think it's worth a try if that is something you'd like to do. And there's the pulp. It is very custardy and yummy. Unfortunately, I'm allergic to pawpaw pulp. I get a wicked rash in my face when I eat it. So I unfortunately can't eat it, but I do save the seeds of my friends that grow the pawpaws and propagate plants from them. And I have a good number of pawpaw trees in my nursery right now. So here's a bunch of edible species that are also trees, and I don't have time to go into a lot of details about these. I'll just, let me just mention the tupelo. So this one grows in West Newbury. The fruit is about the same size as a jelly bean, but it's very, very sour. And so you can make a sauce from it. But it's a gorgeous tree. You see how beautiful red the leaves turn in the fall. So it's worth planting even if all you did was look at it. All right, so groundnut, a native edible species. I've seen this one in West Newbury. The main edible part are the tubers, and you just slice these thinly crosswise and fry them in a little vegetable oil and make these groundnut chips. And you can propagate this plant from these tubers or from the beans. And one place I've seen these beans is along the shore of Lake Gardner in Amesbury. So you might look for them there, although it's possible that the beans might have already split open because they turn brown and split open in kind of a corkscrew way when the beans are ripe. And it's possible they've already done that, but you could try, go look for them. Okay, Jerusalem artichoke is a plant that's native to the upper Midwest, but it was growing all over New England when the early European explorers came, you know, the Samuel de Champlain and the Jacques Cartier types came in the late 1500s, early 1600s, because the indigenous peoples of this region traded for it. And so we had established colonies of Jerusalem artichokes growing before the Pilgrims came. And some of the patches that you see growing in the wild are patches that are likely to have descended from patches originally established by Native Americans. So the main edible part under Jerusalem artichokes are these tubers, and these are just beginning to form underneath the plants right now, because the plants don't bother to grow these during the growing season because the weather's really good. They don't need them. So they grow them as the winter is coming on. And a Jerusalem artichoke, you can cook them most ways. You cook up potatoes, you can bake them, boil them, mash them, fry them, and so on. These will definitely spread in your yard. So not when they spread, not if they spread, but when they spread. And so this one, you're definitely warned by me and everybody else, be careful where you plant Jerusalem artichokes, because they will be there. Even if you make an attempt to gather up every single tuber, some will avoid your capture, and then the plant will grow in that same location again. So be careful where you plant it. In fact, some people I know will plant it like in a confined area, like a half of a whiskey barrel filled up with soil, and plant it in there. And then they could just dump the whiskey barrel out and pick out the tubers that way and get all of them. So that might be a strategy worth following. Okay, so now with just a few minutes left, because I realize I've gone quite along, I just want to give a few examples of some of the projects that I planted. And this text on the left side of the slide is something that Nancy already told you about. So I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, okay, so this is something that's online. If you have any trouble finding it, let me know. I'd be happy to point you to it. This is the list I've compiled of more than 180 species that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people. All right, so here is a viewing of my nursery several years ago, and here's another viewing of my nursery of a part of it with my plants in pots. Here's my stratification fridge, which is a little bit neater and more organized than it was when I took this photo. But this is where I store my seed before I sow it, especially the stuff that needs to go through the stratification period. So here's a list that you don't need to read that mentions some of the projects that Nancy mentioned that I've been working on. So here's one on the North Shore. This is Crown and Shield Island, which is owned by the trustees of reservations off Marblehead. And it's a place I've led wild edibles walks for many, many years. And I noticed some good beach plum habitat on the island, but there were no beach plums. So I asked the trustees, could I plant some beach plums here? And they said yes. And so I walked the island, identified 14 locations to put the beach plums, dug the holes, and then I recruited some volunteers, and we took the beach plums over the mudflat at low tide, and we planted them in the holes that I dug. And this is now 6 years later, and I'm down to 6 plants from the original 14 I planted, but those 6 plants appear to be doing really well, and they've adjusted. And I think, you know, so now there's fruiting beach plums on Crown and Sheet Island where there weren't any before. Here's another project in the North Shore. So this is Baker's Island, 10 acres of which is owned by the Essex National Heritage Area where the lighthouses and the lighthouse keepers' cottages. I do a wild edibles walk out there every summer, did one this summer, to talk about the edible species that were already on the island, plus the ones that I planted on the island. And so we had to add a half an hour to the length of that walk because there are all these additional plants that I could talk about that I planted out there from my nursery. Here's a project I did out in Western Mass on a paddler access campsite that the Appalachian Mountain Club and the state DCR collaborated on. And here we added edible native plants to the campsite so that the canoe campers can supplement the gorp, whatever they're eating, with the wild food that's growing next to them at the site. And here's another one up in Montague where I did the same thing. And here's a site out in Western Mass along the Housatonic River in Great Barrington, wonderful place called Riverwalk that I encourage you to visit if you're ever out in Western Mass. It's a beautiful walk, even if you didn't notice any edible native plants there, but there are some ones that were already growing there, plus ones I planted. Then here's a project down in Buzzards Bay where we planted marsh marigolds along a stream. And then here's a project in Lexington, a town project where there was a collapsed culvert that they replaced by just daylighting the stream, and they had to replant the area where they had done the work with the bulldozers. And so here was a planting plan I developed for them. And here's the crew that put them in. And here's an example of a plant where I looked at the habitat near the daylighted stream, and I said, you know, I think flowering raspberry would be happy here. And look at the plant, it's really thriving. This plant, if I could read its mind, it's sending me this message: thank you, Russ, for planting me here. I'm really happy here. So that's really gratifying when I see that in the landscape. It's a project from the South Shore. This is an organic farm called Holly Hill Farm, where they further diversified what was growing at the farm with edible native plants from my nursery. Here's a book if you want to see a really good book that talks about edible native plants and goes into some detail about which wild birds and other creatures rely upon those plants for food or other kinds of habitat. Although this book is from Cincinnati, it definitely has some applicability to the Northeast. All right, and with that, I'm done talking and I'm happy to take questions, and I hope you enjoyed that talk.
Thank you so much, Ross. That was really amazing. It was a lot of information. I was taking those furiously, but the good thing is this is recorded, so we will be able to watch this again.
So I will leave this slide on for just a few more seconds, and then I'm going to close it so I can see you all in case you have any questions. It'd be easier to talk to you if you put your videos back on and unmute yourself. So let me just get out of here. Okay, stop share. Okay.
She was very comfortable
So I'm
with it.
unmuted.
So Russ, we have one question thus far. Is there any way to eat horse chestnuts?
No. I mean, you know, indigenous peoples ate them, but it was such a protracted, elaborate process that nobody considers them to be edible. So just the American chestnut, when you can find them, and the Chinese chestnut, the Japanese chestnut, the European chestnut, all grow in various places in Massachusetts, although they're hard to find in the wild. Most of you are going to see those chestnuts where people have planted them.
Great. Well, we have lots of thank yous. Any other questions, folks? Come on. Something you've been wanting to know about, some of those possible edible foods out there.
I'd like to say something. My name is Kim Weggers, and we have shagbark hickory trees in our front yard, and they're quite messy. But we also heard that not only can you eat the nuts, but you can take the bark itself and boil it to make like a syrup.
Yes, that is true. And I've had that syrup, and I talk about this in my book. And I have to tell you, at least to me, the flavor of that syrup it reminded me exactly of the water that is in the Vicks Vapor Rub vaporizer.
Oh,
So it was really, I thought it was completely unedible from my perspective.
Okay.
So now, supposedly, shagbark hickory trees have sap, and you can tap them like a maple tree. I have not tried it, so that's not what that bark syrup is made from. So let me try to show you something on screen. Can you all see this? This is a shagbark hickory nut, okay? Because one of the people I know that uses the hickory bark, which I think disfigures the tree. The trees are so handsome because it's got that shaggy bark on there, and plus that shaggy bark is bat habitat. Bats will roost underneath those shaggy bark pieces. So I'm all in favor of leaving the bark on the tree. So for those of you that have been discouraged from eating shagbark hickory nuts because you've been challenged by getting the nuts open, I'm going to show you how I do it. Actually, I don't have the stuff here in front of my computer to show you, but I'm going to describe it for you. So here's a nut with the husk off, and they either fall off the tree like this, or the husk come off within a week or two after you gather them. Ordinarily it's going to lie flat like that on whatever hard surface you have. So I tilt it like that. So the points are coming out on either side, but the steep side is going up and down, and the hard surface is a rock. So it's not my hand or anything. And I'm left-handed, so I'm holding with my right hand on the hard surface like a rock. And I've got a hammer in my left hand, and I'm hitting it right here on the top of the tilted up shell. And I'm not pulverizing the nut, but I'm hitting it hard enough to send cracks through the shell. And more often than not, that's how I get big pieces out. So like when I do my programs, had this been a live program, I would have had jars of hickory nuts with big pieces in there. Now, I would be misleading you if I told you I never used a nut pick, because I use nut picks too. But I am able to extract big pieces out with that hammering method.
so a question, Russ. We hike Holly Hill Farm and see rock tripe.
Yes.
Can you comment?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so this is one I don't have personal familiarity with. There is a mycologist in the Cambridge area who has occasionally prepared it for programs that he does. His name is Larry Millman. And so I would contact him. I'm sure has an online presence, would be easy to track down, and just ask him for details about how to prepare the rock tripe. I basically put rock tripe into an emergency food category, that you could eat it if you were starving and there was nothing else. But, around here in New England, we have so many other tasty edible wild plants. I just don't feel the need to even teach rock tripe to people. And also rock tripe is so handsome on the rocks where it's growing, and it's such a slow growing plant that if you picked it off the rocks, it's not going to come back in any meaningful way. It's going to be off that rock for, a long, long time. And so, so that's my comments on rock tripe. I understand it is edible, and that if you prepare it correctly, it's not that bad tasting, but I prefer to taste the yummier things that are less disruptive in the harvesting process.
Great. What about beech nuts? Can they be used for anything?
Yeah, sure. So whether it's a native beech nut, the Ficus grandifolia, or whether it's one of the other ones like the European beech trees, all beech nuts are edible. The tricky part is gathering them, because the squirrels and chipmunks will go through the beech nuts that have fallen on the ground and pick out all the good ones and leave behind all the bad ones. And so frequently you find a lot of the husks, which looks like a little lemon lozenge, and inside that are two pyramidal shaped things that are the shells that contain the nut meats. Now, if you're lucky, and let's say you time your visit right to a beech tree when like a big storm has come and just rattled the branches and knocked some ripe nuts down, and you're able to find some, the little nuts are quite good. They have almost like a coconutty flavor, so they are worth eating if you can find them. So one harvesting method I've heard for gathering beech nuts is that And by the way, for nut trees, the best nut trees for harvesting nuts from are not going to be in the middle of the woods. They're going to be out in the open. It's kind of like tomatoes in your garden. The more sun they get, the heavier they're going to bear. And this is true for any nut species. Maybe some varieties of oaks, you could find oak acorns in the woods, but generally speaking, I'm out in the open to look for hazelnuts, hickory nuts, beech nuts, stuff like that. So you find a big old beech tree with the nuts still on there that are as close to ripe as possible, but still attached to the tree. And then you just spread some tarps or some blankets underneath the tree. And then you send an agile friend or family member up into the branches to shake them and shake the husks or the nuts loose on the tarps. And that's what I understand is the most effective way to gather lots of beech nuts.
That's great. Question on what is the ethics or rules for foraging on municipal, land trust, DCR, federal and state parks, or fish and wildlife land?
Yeah. So, I mean, that you've just named everything.
I know.
So they all each have their individual rules. So I can be specific in answering that about two different categories that were just mentioned. Okay. So in the case of state land, the state fish and wildlife land, so this are called wildlife management areas that are maintained by the Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. They allow berry picking, like fruit gathering, like if you found a wild apple tree, you could pick the apples, or berry picking, nut gathering, along with mushroom hunting. Those are allowed activities on state wildlife management areas as long as it is for personal consumption only. So you couldn't pick something and give it to a farmer who's going to sell it at a farmer's market. You couldn't pick it and give it to a chef who's going to put it on the menu. That would be all commercial use. But if you yourself eat it, that would be okay to gather it in a wildlife management area. And then here's a really lucky thing for all of you in the audience. I assume most of you are from Northeast Mass, from Essex County. Essex County Greenbelt allows foraging as a permitted activity on all their properties that are open to the public, which is dozens of properties covering many, many hundreds of acres. And that's why, in gratitude for that fact, that's why when I sell a book, the foraging book, like I sell them at my like yesterday when I gave 2 live talks, I brought books with me, I sold them to people, and I keep track of all the money and I send it all to Greenbelt in gratitude for the fact that they allow foraging on their properties. And I told people, just, buy more land with that property, with that money, and just create more foraging opportunities.
Nice.
So those are 2 specific examples I can give about it. But, to talk about all land trusts, all state lands, all federal lands, it gets rather complicated. But at least I can give specific responses in those 2 cases.
Great. How about dewberries? Any edibility there?
Yes. So we have 2 species of dewberries that are native to New England. They both are edible. They both produce a berry that looks and tastes exactly like a blackberry. In fact, a dewberry is just a prostrate form of blackberry. Instead of growing in a tall cane that goes like 4 or 5 or 6 feet up in the air, it sprawls along the ground. The only difference between the 2 species of dewberries is when the fruit ripens. So, and I'm going to possibly get this wrong, but I believe it's Rubus flagellaris is the northern dewberry, and that one ripens earlier. So I'll see those ripe fruit like the 2nd week of July. And then I think it's Rubus hispidus, which is the bristly dewberry, where the fruit is ripe in August at the same time when blackberries are ripe. But yeah, they're both edible the exact same way that a blackberry is edible.
Nice. Have you eaten knotweed?
Oh, sure. Well, this talk just talked about edible natives. But as I said, when I'm out in the landscape teaching about wild edible plants, we're talking about everything that's edible. So I don't know if we'll encounter knotweed at Mill Pond tomorrow, but if we do, I will absolutely talk about it. If you noticed when I had the image of my book up, in the upper left-hand corner, there is a pie. That is a strawberry knotweed pie that I love to make. And virtually everybody I serve that to say, this is even better than strawberry rhubarb pie.
Oh, interesting.
So knotweed is definitely edible. The time it's best for harvesting is from mid-April to early May. You want to get it at the shoot stage. There's nothing edible about the plant now. It's just that a 3-week window in the spring when you want to harvest it, and eat it like asparagus when it's really small, or like rhubarb when it gets taller.
Great. Another question on viburnum species. again, what are the edible ones? You had mentioned.
Okay,
two of
sure.
them.
So there's wild raisin, Viburnum nudum. Sometimes it's called Casinoides, but Viburnum nudum, I think, is the botanical name that's accepted at the moment. Then there's nannyberry, Viburnum lentago. And there's hobblebush, Viburnum. It used to be called alnifolium. Now it's called Viburnum lantanoides. Those are three that are edible. And there's also Viburnum prunifolium, which is black haw. And that isn't really native to New England. It's, I think it's found in natural populations like in southwestern Connecticut, but I have seen it growing in New England, and you could certainly plant it in New England. And so if that was a plant you were interested in, you could definitely try that one in your yard.
And is it the fruit that you're harvesting?
Yes, yeah, it's the
Okay.
fruit. It's
Yeah.
the fruit. And I don't know why my image froze there for a second, but anyway, and the final one I have to talk about is high bush cranberry. So this is, and this one, it's tricky to say exactly what the botanical name is, because it used to be called Viburnum trilobum, and that was a very reliable name. And now I think they're calling it Viburnum opulum ver americanum is the official botanical name of it. But anyway, it has a large flat stone in the center, as do most viburnum fruits. So you mostly spit the seed out, or you try to propagate a plant from the seed, which is what I do. And high bush cranberry seed is, I think, the easiest viburnum to grow from seed, by the way. The one tricky thing about the high bush cranberry is there is a very, very similar looking European plant called the Gelder rose that is frequently mistaken, even by nurseries, for a native high bush cranberry. And the problem, at least from a foraging standpoint about that, is the Gelder rose fruit tastes horrible, no matter how much sugar you add. So ordinarily, high bush cranberry, you have to add sugar to it like you would a regular cranberry to have it taste good. But high bush cranberry makes an excellent sauce like a bog cranberry does, but not the Gelder rose. So what I do to make sure that what I'm growing is the authentic high bush cranberry is I'm gathering it from places, locations that are way up north, like in the Adirondacks or in northern New Hampshire, where the Gelder rose is unknown. And I'm sure that I'm growing the native high bush cranberry then, and not the imposter.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all the questions we have. This has been wonderful, Russ. Really informative.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been an amazing talk. Carol, did you want to mention our next webinar on October 28th?
Yes, October 28th, we have Heather McCargo, who started the Wild Seed Project that Russ mentioned. It should be an amazing lecture on why native plants matter. And as Russ has also stated so much about growing your own natives, Heather's going to be talking about that also. And you can look at the Wild Plant site. They have a wonderful diagram of how to start your own natives very easily. It's something that I started last December, and was showing our Wild and Native group some of the amazing native plants that are ready to put into the ground, that I did put into the ground this fall, and really encouraging everyone to grow native. So that'll be on October 28th at 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, Heather is a good friend of mine. So, wow. But I would say, even if she isn't that, I would greatly recommend her talk, because she's very user friendly in terms of, the kind of audience she's used to talking to are regular people. Yeah. And people that, like a normal regular person, mostly buys plants at a nursery, and they're a little intimidated by growing a plant from seed. But she definitely, presents it in the most user-friendly way imaginable, so you feel very comfortable about doing it. And it's really fun. It is fun to grow plants from seed. Yeah. So I encourage you all to go to that talk and to try it.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Russ. I think we have a lot of information. It's amazing, all the natives we can eat and we can grow in our backyard. And I know that from the little bit of experimenting that I've done that, you know, in the last 6 years we have now in our garden, I think we have plants that we go from May to probably November. Something's always edible. And the great thing is they're low maintenance. And we also have a lot of wildlife that visit our backyard. So it is kind of, as you mentioned, you know, a lot of different ways to enjoy these plants. And, you know, I'm kind of a lazy forager, so I'd rather go out in my backyard than out into the wild. So thank you for joining, and thank you, Russ, for giving this amazing presentation. And yeah, for those of you that's coming to the tour, you'll see Russ tomorrow.
Thank
Great.
you, Russ.
Thank
Look
you,
forward to
everybody.
seeing you tomorrow.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right. See some of you
Bye-bye,
tomorrow.
everyone.